Welcome.
Welcome. Hi there. Um, my name is Malini, uh, and I'm here with my friend Jeff Kalidas, and we're going to be demystifying certain mysteries in Vedic astrology. We are together collaborating and doing a series called Demystifying, whether it's demystifying the houses or the planets. Um, and we're going to take you on a journey to help you understand what Vedic astrology really is and what certain planets and houses really mean. And not in a sensational way, but in a very simple layman's terms. Um, so before we begin, I think both me and Jeff should introduce ourselves. Jeff, why don't you go first?
All right. Thank you, Melanie. So I am Jeff Kraft. Some people call me Kalidas. And I am a non-dual tantric spiritual teacher. And I also have been investigating lots of different tools for healing, transformation. So I've studied, Ayurvedic practitioner, and I'm also a teacher of Vedic astrology, among many other things. I am the founder of the Atlanta School of Tantra Yoga. And I've known Malini for quite a few years and know how much passion she has and how much intelligence she has around this subject as well. And so it's really a pleasure to be collaborating with her on this tonight. So we'll pass it over to the great Malini Iyer.
Hi, I am Malini, and I'm so glad to be doing this series with Jeff, um, who has been a fellow partner on this journey. While I met him in Sam Jeffy's school, he was a mentor in the beginning, and then led us all, a lot of students in Sam's school, through this huge course that Sam has created. I'm a scientist by training, so I love to figure out how things work. My journey with astrology started the same way, wherein certain jargons about astrology was thrown at me, and I wanted to know what they meant. And I'm glad I met Jeff on the journey, because he is not only a great astrologer, but a great spiritual teacher. And I'm really happy that we're doing this demystifying series together, because one thing that most people may or may not know about Jeff is that his special, whatever he calls himself, but his specialization is transformation, right?
Yes.
So I think the first thing that we're going to do in the series is demystify the 8th house.
Yeah, which for me is starting in the sweet spot.
How so? How so? Explain.
Well, because it is the house of transformation. It's one of the important houses of transformation along the journey. And for those who have been looking around for astrology for a while, there are lots of people that sometimes get triggered by different positions in different houses, different planets. And the 8th house is one of the ones that sometimes is considered to be, it's actually called a Dushtana house in the system. So it's a difficult placement. And sometimes people get a little superstitious about that and they become afraid of it. But especially, teaching a non-dual tantric spiritual approach, this is one of the most beautiful houses to me in a way, because it really brings about the opportunity for us to grow and to transform. And, that's the way that I see it. The mastering of this energy, the mastering of the experience of the 8th house is so critical to our transformation and to our spiritual evolution. So to me, it's a beautiful house.
Great. I'm going to start sharing my screen so we all can be on the same page. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So the series, Demystifying the 8th house, I've laid a few slides together, and they are just basic framework structure that we can use to talk about the 8th house. The characteristics of the 8th house. So it is the second moksha house. There are 4 categories of houses: dharma, kama, artha, and moksha. Moksha houses are houses that lead to liberation from whatever is leading up to them. The first moksha house being the fourth house, which is the house of the heart. The second moksha house is eighth house. It comes after the sixth house, which is the house of friction with others. We struggle with others in the sixth house. Our enemies, diseases, deaths, all of that is seen in the sixth house. And the seventh house, where we are finally willing to work with others because all of us are filled with desires. And in order to fulfill our desires, we need the other person. So eighth house comes after sixth and seventh house. It's evolutionary process wherein you realize how fickle or unstable your relationship with the other person is. If you're trying to gain inner peace, inner happiness, inner stability, and you rely on the other person, how unstable that whole structure is. Of course, it also comes after, it's right opposite the second house. Second house is our value systems, which are our securities that we have accumulated throughout our life since childhood, our childhood structures. And eighth house being completely opposite that shows our insecurities, shows in life where we don't have structures, where we don't have boundaries, and how we suffer as a consequence of that. Do you want to add something to that, Jeff?
Sure. The process of the moksha houses, you shared the four different, the four different characteristics of the houses, and they come from a system that's called the purusharthas, or the four goals of life.
Yes.
And so there's the dharma, which is focused on career and purpose, and artha, which is focused on material security and the values that we have. And there's also kama, which is connected to pleasure and enjoyment of life. And then of course, moksha is the house of liberation, as we mentioned. And so this is the second liberation house. And as Malini was sharing, it really comes, there's a flow through the houses that we're evolving with and evolving through. And so it comes after the sixth and the seventh house. So the sixth house, which we'll talk more about in another video together, but the sixth house is where we're really learning how to do the hard work that we need to care for the things that we love in this world. It's not usually a fun place to do, but it's a challenging experience for us. But that also then connects us into the seventh house, where it's the relationship house, where we're doing those fulfilling of mutual desires. And what so commonly happens in a lot of the clients that I have come to me, I find this to be a really positive and helpful framework to help understand where relationship challenges come from, actually, because this movement through the houses brings us up to seventh house, which is relationship. And what typically happens when we start to, because we all desire love and intimacy, but what typically happens when we begin to connect with intimacy is that the fears and insecurities begin to arise in us. And that's what takes us into the eighth house, is those fears and insecurities. And so, there are all kinds of fears and insecurities that can come up of, being afraid that the other person really doesn't love you and they're going to leave you, being afraid that they might kill you in the night. It's because it's all about like, how safe and secure do I really feel? And so, you come into the eighth house and you have all these fears and insecurities, and then the houses, the evolutionary process of the houses really teaches us that, there's a couple of different things, because of course we're going to move into the ninth house from there, but we also have to be willing to look at our fears and insecurities as a process of growth and transformation. Because, if you think about the idea of a stable, loving relationship, you become afraid because of something that happened to you, ultimately probably in your childhood, which is also reflected, in being on the axis with the second house, because the second house is the experiences of childhood. It's the values that we develop. And so that's sometimes where the seeds of those insecurities are created. And so in the eighth house, we're finding ways to really face those fears, to see what's truly rational and what's irrational, because a lot of our fears are actually irrational, especially in relationships, right?
Yeah.
So we take the eighth house as this opportunity to really dive in and create to create that possibility of like shifting ourselves out of that old karmic seed, the way I think of it, like these old karmic patterns that have been developed, and really strengthen ourselves and free ourselves up, which means that in order for us to really strengthen the relationship, we have to go back to the 6th house, do the hard work that we really need to do to improve ourselves or circumstances in the relationship, and then bring it back to the 7th, hopefully with a stronger foundation and connection. And then the process kind of cycles itself over again. So that's a pretty cool structure for people to be able to understand that the reality is, because, you know, nobody wants conflict in relationship. And a lot of people think that conflict is bad or that feeling insecure is bad, but it's actually an opportunity to grow. And when we start to frame it that way, it becomes a really powerful tool to understand that relationship itself can actually be used as a conscious process of spiritual development and growth and personal transformation.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally second that. I've often seen the 6th house kind of friction and conflicts are the ones that you have generally with your colleagues at work and with your peers. But the 8th house kind of transformation that you have is with people you have a deeper attachment with. And the deepest attachment is with your spouse or someone you're having a sexual relationship with. And we can think about it in terms of Scorpio, because Scorpio is the original 8th house of the zodiac, and the nature of Scorpio is this fixed water, but it's just has such irrational fears. There are no boundaries. One is completely vulnerable, and when you're with your partner, you're completely vulnerable. They see you as you are. And that's where your innermost fears get triggered. All the buttons get pushed that were placed, like you said, sometime in your childhood or throughout your life. All your traumas, all the things that are just you don't want people to see, the world to see. You're naked, you're inside out. And then how will you grow now that this person sees you the way you are? And yes, the pain of the 8th house is really showing us not to avoid conflicts or escape from them, but how do you use that conflict to know yourself, use the pain to know yourself. And by knowing yourself, it's not just in an egoistic way, although there is this narcissistic, masochistic tendencies with the 8th house, the manipulative nature, but it's knowing your divine self. Who are you beyond this body? Who are you beyond this material world? And all the pain associated with it, and like going really deep within to find that stability and that calm, which is independent of everything that the world around us is triggering in us.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it invites us ultimately to really learn to face our fears and to learn to accept our vulnerabilities as well, because that's where the fear, you know, a lot of our fears actually arise from vulnerability. Like I said, you know, what is this person going to think of me? Like, if they knew this thing about me, would they still love me?
Yes.
And when we bring those to light in our own consciousness and allow ourselves to accept that part of ourselves, or to shift it if it's something that's not serving our, you know, a purpose for our happiness. But, you know, we bring that to surface, and because like the fear in that moment is that, you know, the partner is going to see us and judge us. But there's opportunities also to like really be open and vulnerable and share that part of yourself, and have the partner receive you and still love you, which also can be a really healing process as well. You know, we talked about this being like the 2nd moksha house. And so one of the things that we're losing, because it's liberation is what moksha stands for.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're being liberated from is our fears and our insecurities and our neuroses and our, you know, our anxieties and those types of things. But there's also a deeper layer of liberation too, which is we're being liberated from some of the delusions that we have about life as well. And one of those delusions oftentimes is thinking that someone else in a partnership and relationship is supposed to make us happy.
Happy.
I'll finally meet the one, and that person will make me happy forever. And even when you meet a great person, there's still going to be the ups and downs of that navigating that path of feeling insecure.
Yeah.
And so eventually there has to be this moment where you're like, oh my God, I get it. Like, this person's never going to totally make me happy. Like, my life can be better with this person. We can have so much fun together. We can have love and vulnerability and, share a great time together and have a great life and all these kind of things. But this one person can never be the total happiness that I'm seeking. Like, there has to be something else.
Yeah.
Which takes a lot of pressure off yourself and the partner when you can really just kind of relax and enjoy and accept each other as you are and find happiness for what it is, while not putting so much expectation on each other as well.
Yes. And also, we expect the other person to make us happy because we are projecting ourselves onto them.
Mm-hmm.
And so 8th house is also the house of illusions, right? Our irrational illusions, more than fear. It's just all our projections that we put on other people, and we project the most on our partner, on this relationship or the spouse that we have, and expect them to fill in our voids. And like you said, yes, one person can never make you totally happy.
Yeah.
And happiness is in our process.
Yeah. And as you mentioned on the slide, the 7th house is where we're learning how to fulfill mutual desires.
Yes.
And so sometimes we start off with really unhealthy expectations about whose mutual desire is most important.
Yeah. So death is also associated with the 8th house. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, from the perspective of debt, it is kind of connected to other people's money as well. We start to look at, other people's money, and but it also has the fears and insecurities that come along with debt. We're not particularly comfortable about having debt in our life, and so that can bring up some insecurities as well. What other aspects of did you say debt or death?
Death. I said death. I'm Indian. I have an accent. I'm sorry. I said death because 7th house is the Marka house, but 8th house is the house is also the house of death. Actually, it is the house of death. That's where accidents happen. That's where people get murdered. And if you go to see, a lot of people who get murdered or killed they're killed by someone whom they know deeply and intimately, and someone whom they completely trust. So death is associated with 8th house, and it's not just death of physical body, but it's just the death of the being on this planet. And do you want to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, well, of course, from a metaphorical kind of perspective, death is a process of transformation as well. And so, thinking about the 8th house as a transformational house, it's those moments where we're doing our healing work, where or process of healing, where we're having those like little mini ego deaths, parts of our insecurities that are dying off, little identifications that we've held to be really strong within ourselves that start to die off. And of course, there are other places where these things are being taken from us as well, such as the 12th house. But in the 8th house, there's this real conscious sort of mysterious energy that's processing and sort of showing us these cycles of waves of information and experience that come up that eventually have to dissolve and to die off. And so it really gives us the opportunity to start allowing parts of ourselves that are not serving our happiness to die in a conscious kind of way.
Yeah, which is the last point of the slide, whereas we have no peace, happiness, stability, or structure, stuff related to 4th house and the 2nd house, until we address this mystery with the other person, where we are just trying to fulfill something up with the other person or get something out of the other person. This mysterious transaction that we are constantly having, until and unless we resolve that, there's no transformation, inner transformation that can take place.
Absolutely.
Yep. So eighth house is also associated with extreme highs and extreme lows in life. And how have you seen that?
I see that, of course, in my own personal process of healing and transformation, I've experienced and lived. Yeah,
Mhm.
because what tends to happen with eighth house energy as it moves through, our lives in various different ways through the transits and activations of the dasha cycles, but as it moves, it starts to bring about changes and transformation,
Mhm.
and or it invites us at least to do that. And what typically is true for most people is we tend to have kind of a comfort zone of what, like we want life to be a certain way because it feels safe to us. It feels sort of secure. And sometimes for some people, like someone who has lots of Scorpio energy, for instance, what feels normal could actually be the wild ups and downs. Like that can be the thing that they really identify with in their life. That's their comfort zone, and getting still can actually be uncomfortable. but for whatever it is, it's like we have a place where we feel things are comfortable. And the eighth house energy and all the ways that it can move really starts to push us outside of our comfort zone because it's asking us to face our insecurities. It's bringing about dramatic changes in our lives. Things break and change through eighth house kind of energy. And so this unexpected kind of thing suddenly shows up that we have to figure out how to deal with, that takes us out of our comfort zone. So it can create a lot of emotional ups and downs, but it can also create like actual manifested transformation and change, and the death, losses of jobs, loss of friends, those kinds of things that really force us to deal with life and the changeability that it has, and how do we navigate that, because it throws us out of our comfort zone.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually resonate with that a lot because I've just come out of um, Rahu Venus. Venus rules my eighth house. And of course, the eighth house is all Lord is also joint Rahu. And just the highs and lows that I've seen, and it's mostly related to other people, wherein I've lost jobs. I've gone from someone wanting to make me a CEO to having no job in the next couple of months, uh, to like having a solo dance debut, but then after that a complete crash down where all my friends are gone, and it's just recycling of people and energies around me, uh, and the whole cycle has actually uh, made me resolve to be more self-reliant, to uh, to go inner, to not be dependent on other people in terms of meeting my innermost desires, fulfilling my innermost desires. But yes, there's an obsessive quality to it, wherein uh, especially in relationship with other people, there's just there are no boundaries. It's just going for it all, giving it all, and just going with the flow and going with the ride, and there are just no brakes, and it's just a car with full acceleration, no brakes, and a wild ride. So yeah, that's what brings the extreme highs and lows in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can feel really unexpected a lot of times. Even sometimes you're kind of in it, whether it's unexpected or you're in it and things are happening, like you sort of are already in the process. Um, it can feel really overwhelming and really destabilizing. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I bet you've noticed this too, is a lot of the clients, when they come for consultations, they have eighth house energy moving through their house, and they're trying to figure out what's going on.
Yes. Yes.
That's of course not the only reason, but there are other planets that can create some transformation and change and destabilization as well. But so often, and probably especially because I'm connected so strongly to the tantric practices, um, I get a lot of clients that really have a lot of eighth house activation when
Okay.
they show up.
So I've pulled up Osho's chart here, and it's because uh, I've I've noticed, and this is said with people who have a really strong eighth house, they have a certain mysterious magnetism to it. to them,
Hmm.
and you feel drawn to them. You don't know why. There's an inexplicable energy, um, or inexplicable beauty, but you're just drawn to their magnetism. And it was interesting to me, especially in Osho's chart. He is, as you can see, he's Taurus rising, and he has a bunch of planets in his 8,000 Sagittarius. He has Saturn, which is his ninth and 10th lord, Moon, which is his third lord, Venus, which is its first and sixth lord, Mercury, which is second and fifth lord, Mars, which is the seventh and 12th lord. He has like 5 planets in there. Um, and he lived a very interesting life. He would draw in these crowds, uh, not only in India, but all over the world. Uh, he built his commune here, which was a self-sustaining community. It was an experiment that they had done, and had gone wild. It was just wild and crazy, known as the sex guru, uh, and died a very mysterious death. Everything about him was a big mystery.
Yeah.
Uh, and do you want to elaborate on that? Just the mysticism of people with a strong eighth house.
Yeah, and of course, we know that Osho was a very controversial character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are varying, various different opinions that swing very wildly to people who adore him, to people who think he was a fraud and a con man and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But that also, kind of surrounds part of the mystery of him, like, because the eighth house energy does have the potential to create sort of a mysterious deception, manipulative kind of quality, because being in that energy, being, especially as, with 5 planets there, you start to learn about what that process of transformation is, but you also start to learn about what people's insecurities are and how you can manipulate their insecurities to get what you want.
Yeah.
The other thing that I had started to say when I thought you were talking about debt rather than death was because I was trying to figure out where you were going. I wasn't sure. But it does represent other people's money. And so I also think it's interesting, like, knowing in his timeline how much money he amassed, how much wealth he amassed through his followers.
Yeah.
That allowed him to create, his compound in the United States and all the things that he did. And then even in his life as a teacher, there were, I think, years where he was, not even coming out to the public to give, speeches, where he was, renouncing, completely just not talking, like he had, sort of renounced speech. And so that was even more mysterious, because then all you have is this guy with lots of magnetism walking around, and you have all these stories that you're projecting onto him. And
Yeah.
it's like, he's really, of course, a mystery, because you're literally not getting anything from him, in terms of an external kind of information. But you're still fascinated, or at least there were people who were fascinated by him, that then projected the stories onto what was happening, even in his silence, that they're experiencing all this stuff, which of course is part of that mysterious power too. It's like, how could he have so much power over people and he wasn't even talking?
Yeah. Yeah. That was Osho's magnetism, his mysticism. Uh, do you see that in your clients, in your everyday practice, where people have a really strong eighth house, and they have this just mysterious energy that just is so inexplicable, and you can't, like, it's like Angelina Jolie kind of a character. You just can't explain the magnetism, but you're so drawn and obsessed, and
Yeah, I think, I certainly see, because in the eighth house, and this is part of kind of the tantric way of thinking of things too, it's kind of the discovery of what some people might refer to as, I call it life force energy, just to kind of keep it simple. But, some people refer to it as a spiritual energy of Kundalini. And, I also talk about Kundalini in what I teach. sometimes have a little bit different way of explaining it than other people do. So I like to kind of keep it basic and just call it life force energy. But there is this spiritualizing energy that lives in all of us.
Yeah.
And it is said to have a connection and a link to sexual energy as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the magnetism that can begin to develop in there, in some sense, is a refined version of that sexual energy, because part of the process of sexuality or sexual energy, and this doesn't have to literally be about sex as we understand it, but it's this energy of magnetism, of drawing, of that attractive nature of being drawn to, and that's where that magnetism can come from. So people who are really connected to and free and comfortable with that level of kind of eighth house sexual energy can be very, attractive to people, even if it's not necessarily in a classically physical way. That there is just something that does draw. But that energy in Tantra, we're really learning it's not so much about sex as it's learning how do we take that energy and begin to transform ourselves and transform our nervous system and our sense of self and the world around us, and use that energy in a way that we actually can connect more with the aliveness of life, like letting ourselves make love to life as opposed to just a physical person, another person, where you're able to channel that energy in a way that life itself becomes a reflection of like divine bliss, and that becomes part of the process. But in terms of the clients that I have come, I mean, certainly I see lots of different configurations and the ways that it shows up. I do see people that, that are really going through lots of transformation themselves, or they really have, lots of wild swings in their history, their karmic history, or they had very tumultuous kinds of experiences in their childhood that have brought out a lot of, maybe trauma or those kinds of things that need to be worked through for them. So there are lots of ways that it does show up. And of course, being in that energetic space, especially when you start to get comfortable with it, it also starts to bring on that intuitive awareness of being able to like feel and read the energy of other people. So I also see it manifesting sometimes in like psychic sensitivity with people. And sometimes they haven't necessarily mastered it, and they can even feel overwhelming to them, the sensitivity that they have.
Yeah, intuition. Definitely, I've seen it with people who have a strong eighth house. They have a sense of intuition, and like you said, it comes from refining their own energies to the extent that they can start reading other people's energies and auras. And a lot of people who I know are teachers in the Kundalini yoga community have a strong eighth house, and they do claim to be able to see other people's auras, and they don't see them as physical bodies, but they see them as energies moving through. The other thing that we slightly touched upon in the previous slide was, and you brought it up, is the pain of the eighth house, right? The deep pain that we have associated with others, the deepest fears we have. When we transform that, how it leads us to the ninth house, which is our higher principles, our own higher self, our own higher teachings. And to get to the ninth house, to get to that higher state of being and consciousness, how it's really important to do the work in the eighth house, wherein you have to really go down deep within you and dig that entire dirt or darkness out. And I don't mean as darkness as bad, but address everything within us that creates these ripples and waves, so that we can actually reach our highest of the highs. So to reach the highest of the highs, you have to go to the lowest of the lows. And, then that high is sustainable. Your highest spiritual goal is sustainable by doing the work in the eighth house.
Yeah, absolutely. And that builds off of a couple of other layers of that eighth house experience. We were talking about the eighth house, sort of being the liberation house, where we're being liberated from our fears, but also from our delusions.
Yes.
And when we start to wake up and think like, oh, wait a minute, there's no person, like there's no lover that I'm going to have that's going to complete me and make me happy for the rest of my life. And of course, during the process of transformation, whether you're consciously connecting it to spirituality or not, there is this sort of mysterious process that begins to change you.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start to change, you start to connect with sort of a hidden part of yourself, because as you were pointing out to, part of what the eighth house is also like hidden things. And what we're actually looking at are these hidden parts of our subconscious mind of, different karmic patterns that we haven't, wounds that we haven't resolved yet. And that's where the fears and insecurities come from.
Yeah.
So it forces us to shine the light of our consciousness down into the darkness, as you were talking about, to be able to see these things that are causing the insecurities, which of course ultimately then are bringing fear and suffering to us. We don't want that. So
Yeah.
we learned tools, or we get support to help us to be able to look at these subconscious insecurities that have been these hidden parts of ourselves. And it actually takes a lot of psychic energy to repress and to pretend like things don't exist in our conscious mind.
Yeah.
And so once we find the strength to be able to go down and face those insecurities, I sometimes with my clients will talk about preparing them to slay the dragon. Like we're going to prepare you to go into the darkness and have battle with the dragon. But once you go in and you face that, and you actually clear out the old energy that's been in the subconscious mind, kind of running you and causing your insecurities and your fears, et cetera, the energy that you had invested to not look at it becomes freed and brought into your consciousness, into your body, into your nervous system, into your energy field. And so you actually gain energy through that process.
Yeah.
And so you're going through that, you're feeling your insecurities, all your illusions are being busted, and you're starting to realize, like, all this weird stuff's happening to me, and maybe you're starting to get interested in the occult and astrology and tarot cards and all this kind of stuff is on the path of discovering that. But then you're also like, and there's not this person in the world that's going to make me happy forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start to ask yourself, well, there has to be something more than this. There has to be something more meaningful than what this is. And that is also part of what takes us in the ninth house, as you were talking about.
Yeah.
The search for that higher sense of purpose and meaning, because it like the illusion gets busted that there's something about, like, the deepest meaning is not in our relationship with other people. There has to be something else.
Yeah.
And so we start walking forward through that transformational energy, usually with enthusiasm, sometimes sort of pushed to find something else that has more meaning to it.
Yeah. 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 And all the power of the eighth house, which brings us to the next subject, is how do we harness it? Right. And I just have a few pointers here, but Jeff, you're the person who has the most expertise in my group of people that I know who have really done the work to harness the transformative energy of the eighth house. For youngsters especially, who have a strong eighth house and have this eighth house kind of magnetism going on, attraction kind of going on, if I get these charts, and I've also heard from James Braha, to be protective of these youngsters, because they can attract a lot of abuse, assault, and like you said, it could also lead into, they could use that as a deceptive, manipulative energy, where they use their sexual energies to get what they want. So that's one of the things. But do you want to elaborate on that?
I think that you've said it fairly clearly. It's just the understanding, to me at least, that when especially that children, if they have a lot of eighth house energy, that the themes that we've been talking about of sex and death, and we didn't really talk so much about, like, sort of the darkness of things, of sort of like the underbelly of the underworld of like I kind of think of, like, kids going through like a goth phase, for instance.
Yes.
Where everything's focused on death, like that can really be a part of the eighth house energy as well.
Yeah.
But it's also the willingness, the willingness to be able to explore, or maybe even be thrown into kind of the dark places in life. And so sometimes that can be uncomfortable things like, abuse and hidden secrets and those types of things. And so there, of course, we don't want to be raising our children with the fear that all those things are going to happen, or the assumption that they will, and create fear around it. But we want to be recognizing, like, where their psychology may go and where their energy may be flowing in a way that that may put them at risk of creating ups and downs and, various types of trauma that might come out of that. And
Yeah.
so being a little bit protective on their behalf while they're developing their relationship to that energy, which of course is natural in and of itself,
Mm-hmm.
but being a healthy guide that can sort of ground and help them harness that energy in their lives, and hopefully keep them out of trouble,
Yeah.
as we should do for all children.
Yeah.
But there are some specific concerns about eighth house energy potentially as well.
Yeah. The thing that we have not talked about is the energy of research, right? You see scientists and
Mhm.
researchers also through eighth house, because it is the way modern science is conducted. It is literally drilling down the hole. You're going down the rabbit hole and you're digging deeper and deeper to discover facts and truths. And um, so that's one of the ways you can harness the eighth house energy, where you can use all that energy to inquire about a particular subject that really interests you. And some of us walk around with the title of a scientist, but all of us are scientists, all of us are researchers, and use that energy, especially in children, like, to channel their curiosity over towards inquiry and discovery in a healthy way. Um, Also, overcoming and addressing fear is a big thing about eighth house. Therapy, going through therapy and really healing your traumas, like you said, so that it frees up all that energy which you have used to suppress things that you don't want to look at. Uh, and I've heard this before, wherein um, and Osho was one of those people who had said it, but in order to really make uh, big or significant spiritual progress, one needs to heal the mind, heal the traumas, and go through therapy. Do you have something to elaborate on that?
Yeah, specifically to that question, um, anything that's happening in our inner awareness, our mind, that could create some kind of disturbance to us, is going to be a distraction to spiritual focus, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
There's a quote that is attributed to the Buddha. I may quote it or I may paraphrase it, but the idea is that he said that you cannot teach a starving man to meditate.
Yes.
And the reason is because this actually gets back to the goals of life. But, when your basic needs aren't being met, you're having these fears and these insecurities of, how am I going to find more food? Maybe I don't have enough shelter, or maybe I'm just uncomfortable because I haven't eaten, all these body sensations that really feel uncomfortable. And so that would create a very uncomfortable, sort of tumultuous kind of experience for somebody. And the point being that when those basic needs aren't being met, when we don't feel a deeper sense of peace in our lives because we've handled and stabilized our life enough to be able to feel safe and secure, that we can't really focus on the higher connections of spirituality that a spiritual seeker would really want to. So it becomes a distraction at that level.
Yeah.
And you were also, of course, talking about addressing fears and the process of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that transformational model, there are stages to the process of growth in this, and we kind of refer to it as the evolutionary process. In this case, the eighth house.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us might have an experience of this. Some of us get the lesson earlier and faster than others, but there's kind of a stepping stone that comes through this of, like nobody goes to therapy because their life is going well. I'm sure there's the rare, like 0.001% that might. But most people don't go to therapy or they don't go to therapy until they feel like their life is so out of control that
Mm-hmm.
they don't know how to handle it anymore. Or there's something specific that feels out of control. And the eighth house is part of what creates that sense of loss of control. Like
Yeah.
that's where we start to realize we're not really in control of much of anything. And
Yeah.
that feels really scary. And
Yeah.
so, you know, initially, a lot of times if we start looking at the evolutionary process of the eighth house, you know, there's this tendency to want to avoid it, to sort of deny it, to try to control our fears and say, I'll just sort of muscle through this, but I'm still scared, but I'm not going to let anybody know. I don't want to deal with this. That can sometimes be sort of a first layer of even being in denial that you're having some kind of issue. And I know from, you know, clients that I've worked with and, you know, my own experiences in life and other people I've seen earlier in my days when I was really focused, you know, in specific, like just learning about healing for myself, for instance, like there's kind of a sense of pride sometimes of, you know, I don't, like, I should be able to do this on my own. I don't need help. Like it's a sign of weakness to go to a healer or to go to a therapist, sometimes in people's mind, which can create real problems for people who have true anxiety or depression, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important, for people to understand that denying and avoiding is not going to help you at all, and that everyone needs support and help at some point. And if you're having a particular uncomfortable experience of fear or anxiety or problems in your relationships or depression or whatever it is, that it's healthy to actually go get help.
Yeah.
And so the next layer then, once we've kind of broken through that denial phase, is that we start to actually embrace and accept that we have to face these fears. That, you know, the willingness to actually look at our fears and our insecurities as part of life and managing them, so that we're going to create some sort of psychological comfort in our life, to get stabilized enough, you know, hopefully to be able to meditate, but at least to start feeling safe and secure again.
Yeah.
And so, you know, traditional talk therapy, in some contexts, of course, there are lots of different models, there are lots of different people who use different techniques. But in a sense, like the talk therapy that most of us think about is really learning how to manage those fears. Like, how do we live in the world with better understanding, better acceptance of this is the way things are. And, you know, from that perspective, of course, it's very helpful. It's a good stabilizing place. And even for people who are doing deeper transformation, the tools that are oftentimes associated with therapy, like, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, of
Mm-hmm.
like learning how your thoughts are affecting and impacting the experience that you have. You know, those can be really powerful and helpful tools. But what I observed in myself and what I've observed in other people working with them is that sometimes that talk therapy really just isn't enough.
Yeah.
It might get you to a stable place, but it doesn't actually do the deep transformational work that really frees you from the fears. It just helps you put a Band-Aid on them for a while.
Yeah.
And of course, it has lots of value, and I'm not trying to, you know, it's definitely a great place to start, especially for certain people. But
Yeah. Yeah, and therapy has changed a lot over the years. That's evolved so much. There is EMD now,
mhm,
and DBT, and all kinds of therapies, which has it's a newer field, but it's constantly evolving and changing to address people, especially with stuff like trauma. PTSD was not even recognized as a disease. Mental health has not been recognized as a disease, and people are coming to more and more better awareness about uh, diseases of the mind and how to use therapy, and even uh, you know, uh, use psychoactive agents to
mhm.
really address certain specific problems which are pretty deep. So yeah, it's an evolving process,
Yeah,
like you said.
absolutely. And there has definitely been a lot of work that's increasing trauma awareness in the therapeutic process.
Yeah.
And, you know, and helping people find tools that will prevent them from just putting Band-Aids on deep trauma and
Yeah.
actually be able to start transforming their lives.
Yeah.
So that's really cool.
Yeah.
Um, and so, you know, once we get to that stable place, which of course, even, you know, when I have people come to me, like if they're really out of sorts, like the first thing to do is just to help them get stable,
Yeah.
like help them just find some comfort in their life,
Mm-hmm.
and then invite them, if they want to really explore how deeper transformational processes can really transform their lives and potentially lead them through spiritual practices.
Yeah.
Um, so once we've kind of gotten beyond the, you know, just I want to be psychologically comfortable, and I've accepted that I have these fears I have to look at, but I want to be comfortable, then the next level of that evolutionary process is the invitation of like consciously facing those fears,
Mm.
and using it as an intentional practice to awaken wisdom, insight, and to to create an intentional process of inner transformation, which
Mhm.
is where we really get into the tantric concept.
Yeah.
Where we're looking at tantric practices as that level of extension of continuing through specific practices to be bringing up those things from our subconscious mind that we haven't necessarily processed yet, and find safe ways to really move them out. And it doesn't necessarily even mean, because at this point hopefully you have a psychological comfort, like you should actually be living a relatively healthy, happy life when you start doing these things. But instead of there being, I'm looking at my fear and now I'm afraid, it's I'm looking at this fear that I can see as being like energy patterns and things that could be affecting me, but it's not from a place of like I'm totally afraid of it. It's more of a, I know if I remove that from my consciousness, if I purify that from my energy field, my nervous system, that I will have more energy, more spiritual energy that's freed up. We're getting
Mhm.
back to that concept of Kundalini or life force energy,
Mhm.
that we're activating more and more of that level of energy, which
Mhm.
supports the process of transformation even further.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you use deity practice in tantra? Because I know Kali and Shiva are, and your name is Kalidas. Kali and Shiva are very closely associated with tantric practices, and tantra came down from Shiva, was his legacy to the world. And so, do you people to resolve patterns and problems of the eighth house? Do you generally direct them to a deity practice?
I do encourage daily practice, but I always make sure it's the right time too.
Okay.
And certainly there are some times when I'll recommend a particular like planetary puja, for instance, when I'm working with clients, if I want to help, strengthen, Venus energy or, balance Saturn energy or that kind of thing. Of course, they have to be open to it. They have to understand why they're doing it. Not everybody necessarily is going to be interested in that.
Yeah.
But as far as the tantric practices themselves, um, then connecting to, as you mentioned, my spiritual name is Kali Das, and I have a very strong connection to Kali. Um, and the expression of Kali and also Shiva as being those sort of destructive forces of really, we were talking earlier about that death of it becomes like a conscious sacrifice of letting these parts of yourself die, the illusory parts of your identity die, the fears, the illusions, all those types of things, like we're consciously inviting them to die. And so calling upon the force such as Kali or Shiva to invite us to teach us how to use their energy as part of our transformation, and to invite them into the process, so that I'm encouraging Kali to take away my illusions, to take away my fears, to take away my fantasies, to take away, my insecurities, to, all these kinds of things. I'm inviting her into my life and in my spiritual consciousness to be able to do that. And, encouraging that level of sadness. So I definitely encourage it. It's not necessarily for everybody, of course, and there's usually a right time for it to happen, because, it's as I tell people when I introduce even just basic pujas at all, like even if it's something that seems a little more innocuous like Lakshmi or, a Venus puja or something like that, is that these deities, they live as existing, like they actually exist as conscious energy.
Yeah.
They're actually a form of consciousness. There is a being somewhere that thinks of itself as Kali, for instance. You really don't want to make her angry. You have to respect her. But it's also a reflection of like the potential of our own consciousness too. Like it lives on all these different planes.
Yeah.
And so there's a Kali energy that actually is part of my consciousness, because it's, we're all kind of this one conscious being, and these different expressions. And so there's Kali that can move through me, but there's also Kali that I can relate to. There's Kali that's me, and there's Kali that's outside me, and it's all kind of one and the same.
Yeah.
um, but that becomes part of the process of working with it. It's kind
Yeah.
of,
It's really invoking that energy within, even though the form is external, the
yes.
invocation is within. Um, and in my practices, I've seen it's easier to connect to a deity, and this comes later on, like you said, later on in the journey where you have already addressed a lot of your issues. Either you have gone through therapy or you're at a normal, quote unquote, normal basic state of being where you can functional healthily in life,
Hmm.
and you have some form of a meditative practice or a spiritual practice, and it has to be a discipline. It has to be a sadhana, has to be done every day. That's when you invoke these energies, even though the form is external, it does something to you within. And it's very hard to dissect it intellectually. Uh, but and more than connecting to planetary energies, although the planetary energies are filtered down through these forms, it's easier to connect to a deity practice because there are stories associated with them. There's a form associated with them. And Kali and Shiva are definitely associated with destruction of all our attachments, all the
Hmm.
demons within. Uh, but also like transforming that using your own energies, especially sexual energies, to reach to a higher state of consciousness. But yes, has to be dealt with very carefully. And if people have not done it before, they have to seek someone out who can really guide them and not take them down a dark path, but
Yeah.
really guide them uh, towards a higher consciousness. And that's what all of us want. We, at some level, want liberation. We all want moksha. And it's not really liberation in the sense, a lot of us just want liberation from the fear of death,
Right.
fear of, you know, we all that live different forms of the fear of death, and just liberation from that. And that's where the process of enlightenment even begins. Uh, so it's a long process and cannot be dealt uh, fickly, in a very fickle way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Deity practice is not something that you want to read in a book and decide you're going to do on your own.
Yeah.
It's best to find someone who's, very familiar with it, either by, traditional faith or a spiritual teacher, or somebody who really knows and understands it that can guide you through the process. Because it can be very intense, and as the energies awaken. And one of the things that I was going to share earlier too is, I always let people know that, like, you have to go into it with a real sense of reverence,
Mm-hmm.
because you are developing a conscious relationship with the energy of that
Mm-hmm.
deity. And as I was saying, like, there are multiple layers to it, because there is the potential of thinking of it as being like there's this actual Kali being, which can exist, but ultimately you're also awakening the vibration of that expression within your own consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's where the deeper power is, recognizing that it's actually a potential energy that vibrates in your own consciousness, that you're
Mm-hmm.
calling forth and invoking into your consciousness, your body, your energy field, to bring about the transformation and the healing, or the connection to what it is that you're wanting to connect to as part of your sadhana, which most people probably know, but sadhana is the formal name for a spiritual practice.
Yes. Yes. So, as we close here, do you have any closing thoughts?
I think we've covered a lot of ground, and there's nothing that comes to my mind that feels like it has to be added. I think we've covered a lot.
Okay.
How about you?
Um, for closing thoughts, I just want to reiterate the power of the eighth house, and the actual power is that of healing and liberation.
Hmm.
And that's why you see a lot of healers in the eighth house, because their original intention was to heal themselves. You see a
Hmm.
lot of astrologers from eighth house because they wanted to understand their own psyche. Uh, so it has a great healing potential, and it needs to be handled with care.
Absolutely. And and I will add a little bit onto that too, that the eighth house does deal with hidden things, which in the beginning, a lot of it is our own hidden nature. It's parts of ourselves that we haven't yet brought into conscious awareness,
Yeah.
to learn to love and to accept. And so it's that process of transformation that really allows our soul to evolve and can really catapult us into a deeper searching for truth and higher spiritual awareness, and in kind of a way of just really self-discovery. It doesn't even have to be what we think of as a traditional religious concept, but just discovering the hidden power of who you actually are, and
Yeah.
the power that actually exists within you, and being able to manifest and harness that energy and free yourself from the delusions and the fears, by overcoming the hiddenness of what you've been afraid of.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you want to get in touch with us, this is our contact information. This video will be up on both our channels with our contact information. Thank you. Thank you so much for being
Thank you.
here.
Thank you all, and thank you, Malini.
Thank you. Thank
See
you,
you next
Jeff.
time. Bye.
See you next time. Bye.